Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to talk about a book that I read recently and one that I really enjoyed and that I hope more people will discover. I don't do full book reviews a whole lot on my channel, but usually I will do it when I feel like I have a lot to say about a specific book that would merit a whole video. And in this case, I feel like I have a lot to say. And again, I'm really enthusiastic about the book, and I really hope that more people will discover it. And if you follow along, you know that I have been working on a project where I am reading every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I recently read His Family by Ernest Poole, which was the very first winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. As part of this endeavor, I try to take a look at what the year in publishing was like when a book that won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction was published. It helps me place the winner in the landscape of books that were released that year, for one thing, and for another, it helps me get a sense of whether or not the winner really deserved its prize. 1917, the year that His Family was published, turned out to be a big year for American literature. Edna Ferber was among the authors who released books that year for a novel that I had never heard of, Fanny herself. But I have heard of Edna Ferber mainly because just 8 years after Fanny herself was published, Edna Ferber became a winner of the Pulitzer Prize herself. Here is my Franklin Library edition of So Big. If you follow along, you know I am obsessed with the Franklin Library editions of these Pulitzer Prize books. I managed to find a lot of them in really good condition. This one, unfortunately, has like a little bit of whiteout or something on it, but it's fine. It's still a very pretty edition of this book, and I'm even more looking forward to reading it now that I have read Fanny herself. And I'd also heard of Edna Ferber because she wrote the book that the movie Giant was based on, and she wrote the book that the musical and later movie Showboat was based on. And curious, I looked into what Fanny herself is about, and the premise intrigued me, so I decided to read it. There is an edition of the audio on Scribd that has an appalling cover. I'll put it up. It's appalling. To me, it looks like a cozy mystery, which is fine. Cozy mysteries are fine. But that's not what this book is. It's terrible. It's appalling. So I'm not going to use that cover. I'm going to use this one instead. It's much better. But because this book is so old, published in 1917, again, there isn't really a copyright, so you could probably find copies of this book if you have Scribd. Again, the audio is out there. I think they might have an ebook as well. I don't tend to read ebooks, so I didn't look at it. But you can find copies of this book. You probably won't in your local library, but they are out there because, again, there's no copyright on this book. The novel begins establishing a sort of unique conversational format, one where Edna Ferber is in direct conversation with the reader. In the preface, she pokes fun at the established tropes of biographical novels and how male they usually skew. I found this to be delightful. Then she tells the reader that she is going to introduce our titular protagonist by introducing us to her mother, Molly, instead. For it is only really possible to understand the hero's journey of sorts that Fanny is about to embark on without first getting to know her mother, Molly. Living in Winnebago, Wisconsin, Molly Brandeis inherits a store named Brandeis Bazaar when her husband dies while both of her children are young. Molly had always had a better head for business than her husband anyway, so under her leadership, the store really begins to thrive. But the demands of the store take up a great deal of Molly's time and energy, especially when Fanny's brother, Teddy, exhibits a proficiency for music that will take a lot of money to support. Not only does Molly have to devote herself to her work in order to support herself and her children, but she also has to make a sort of Sophie's choice about which child she will work to push ahead in the world. And unfortunately for Fanny, Teddy is the more obvious candidate at the time, owing to his musical ability and, well, his maleness. And so Molly and Fanny endure years of hard self-denial in order to send Teddy to New York. And for his part, Teddy is the perfect embodiment of clueless male privilege. He eventually kind of sees the sacrifice that Fanny and their mother made for him, but he never really appreciates it or what it would have been like to sacrifice something like that because he has never had to do that himself. It's not really a spoiler to reveal that Molly passes away in Fanny's early adulthood because in the conversational opening, Ferber informs the reader that Molly is going to be exiting the story soon enough. From there, the novel sends Fanny out into the world to find her own fortune in the world of business. And she begins to juggle a multitude of topics without letting a single ball drop. Edna Ferber does a really great job balancing all of the aspects of this novel. There's Fanny's identity as a woman during the time of women's suffrage. The suffrage movement makes a more explicit appearance late in the book that feels quite emotional. I had been thinking that it was interesting that she wasn't involving the suffrage movement during the first half of the book. It does come up later, and I think maybe because all this groundwork has been laid for it, it really hits you in the chest when it does arrive. There's also the fact that Fanny is Jewish. There's World War I, which is never shown or discussed in detail, but makes a big impression on this world, even at a remove. And perhaps most significantly of all, there are the realities of industrialism. One of the things that is most surprising about Fanny herself is how it still feels remarkably relevant and urgent, even more than 100 years after it was published. A great deal of that is due to how humane the story is and how innately perceptive Edna Ferber was about what it felt like to be alive and adrift in a changing world. The same year that this was published, Sinclair Lewis published a novel called The Job that promises to dive into the realities of a woman attempting to break into the world of business. In fact, I'll put the jacket up for a second because the first edition of the book boldly proclaims that it is, quote, perhaps the first novel to give the real, all caps real, day-to-day life of women on the job, in the world of offices, and in love, end quote. I attempted to read The Job and only made it about 4 chapters in. Like many masculine novels of its day, including Ernest Poole's His Family and The Harbor, The Job feels like a political pamphlet masquerading as a novel. It is desperately straining to make a point to the reader, and meanwhile, there was a book by a female author that came along and did everything The Job professes it wants to do, but without any of the strain and effort. And it has a lot more to say and a lot more perspective and a lot more empathy. It's just so much better. It may also be a bit disturbing that a century after this book was published, we're still stuck dealing with a lot of the same problems. Part of Molly's burden with the store is that her small community business is threatened by mail order catalogs that promise convenience and affordability. When I was a child, the threat for small businesses had changed to superstores like Borders, Barnes & Noble, Home Depot, and Walmart. And today, it's still a relevant conversation because of the threat online retailers like Amazon pose to small businesses across the country. But I suppose we can take heart that every threat to small business over that century has ultimately failed to eliminate them completely. I still think we really need to be careful about supporting small businesses. I'm wearing a t-shirt from an independent bookstore that I love in Vermont, and I would ask you to please continue to support them as well because we need them in our communities. Fanny herself also deals with grief and the ways it can exhibit itself in really surprising ways. Molly Brandeis has a profound impact on her daughter. Molly's community spirit, her business savvy, her giving nature, her kindness, and her hardworking attitude defined who Fanny grew up to be. But after Molly is gone, Fanny tries her best to reject those attributes, believing that they never got her mother anywhere. After her mother is gone, Fanny looks around and she wonders that her mother had worked so hard and what was it for? Because no one is going to remember her. The store is ultimately going to go away, and she feels like the mother's legacy is gone. She doesn't quite realize that her mother's legacy lives on in her. And so Fanny sells the family store and goes to work for one of the mail order catalogs her mother had been so worried about. And although her position in the company is hampered by her womanhood, Fanny proves alarmingly adept at the world of business. But at what cost? In a way, Fanny herself is also about finding a way to survive and maintain your humanity in a world that has been designed, ironically, by humans, to remove that very humanity. A world where you may be forced to sell out your ideals just to be able to afford to survive. And that is also something that is still relatable. I have many friends and family members who have taken jobs just for the benefits, namely health insurance. I work my job because it pays our mortgage. And I have known people who went to work for Amazon, even though they despise the company, because they need the paycheck. Even though, again, they don't believe in what the company stands for. And I don't blame them for doing something like that. It's a sort of rigged system that we live in. But Edna Ferber navigates this dynamic with surprising grace, eloquence, and style. Because Fanny herself honestly never feels like anything other than a good, funny novel. It shows you the complicated nature of the world without beating you over the head with a message. And it shows you that maybe every person can find a way to marry their passion with their profession. It's not an easy thing to do, and I don't think Edna Ferber is naive about how possible it is, but she does have some characters that manage to find ways to take their true passion and turn it into a job. And that can definitely be a difficult thing to do. I mean, I do my BookTube channel because I love it. It gives me strength and power and creative energy and all of that stuff. I would love for it maybe to someday be my job, but that's not really going to be a possibility, I don't think. But in the meantime, it gives me fulfillment. So although it's not replacing my job, it sort of goes in hand with what Edna Ferber is doing here in Fanny herself. In case you can't tell, I really loved this novel, and I really hope that more people will discover it. Because even among Edna Ferber's works, it feels like it's pretty unknown. Again, when people talk about her, they usually talk about Giant first and foremost. They might talk about So Big because it won a Pulitzer Prize, and maybe they're a fan of musical theater, and therefore they will go to Showboat. And by the way, I managed to track down 2 of her books in hardcover at my local used bookstore because I am really looking forward to reading more of her works. She instantly became an author that I am looking forward to. So I obviously already have a copy of So Big that I'm going to read as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. And I found a copy of Showboat. I love this because it is a facsimile of the 1926 edition of the book. I'll put a link to the book haul video where I talk about both of these books at more length and in more detail, but I'm really looking forward to reading this. I watched the movie of the musical that I believe was done in the 50s as a child many times, and I think it would be a lot of fun to read the book, especially now that I've experienced Edna Ferber's writing and how funny and witty she is. I think it will be a really great reading experience. I also found this hardcover of Ice Palace, which is definitely one of her lesser known novels, but it sounds really interesting. It's about Alaska as a territory while it was moving into statehood and the sort of controversies and compromises that had to be happening. Again, because I have seen what Edna Ferber can do with a moral conundrum and navigating the ethics of certain situations and still telling a very empathetic and human story. I think this could be really great as well. I'm going to keep my eyes out for a copy of Giant. My local used bookstore does have a copy of Giant, but it's paperback and it's really beaten up, so I'm going to leave it alone, and hopefully I'll find a nicer copy at some point. And so those are the ones I have so far, and those are probably the ones I'm going to be going to next. And we'll see how that goes. But I definitely would recommend Fanny herself. It is a gem that is waiting for more people to discover it, and I hope that more people do. If you have read Edna Ferber, I'd love to hear your thoughts on her. Maybe you have a recommendation for where I should go next. Maybe it's not actually So Big or Showboat or any of those, or Giant. Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you have thoughts about anything else, let me know. I will put a link to the video that I did about his family and the year in which it won the Pulitzer down below as well. Honestly, I think Fanny herself should have been the winner of the first Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I loved it that much. I think it's a better book than his family, and I think it would have been a better winner of the first Pulitzer Prize. I think it would have set a better template for what the prize could be, especially if the Pulitzer Prize had really stuck with the idea of rewarding women. In its first 15 or maybe 20 years, it did reward women a fair amount, and then that really dried up quickly, especially by the 1950s. So things could have been very different if Edna Ferber had been the first winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and I like the idea of that world. So I will leave it at that. As always, I really appreciate your time. And again, let me know if you have any thoughts about anything I've said in this video in the comment section down below. And I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.